Life's a funny thing. Some of us are dealt some pretty cruddy cards, and then we're expected to just grow up, normal. That leaves a lot of us to struggle as we navigate through life's difficult times. And if you're anything like me, you have no idea what the hell normal is. Welcome to the Wishbone Podcast with me, your host, Luke Ohana, as we discuss and share our life stories in hopes of helping each other out. So if you got 30 minutes, let's talk about it. Welcome to the very first episode of the Wishbone Podcast. I can't believe I'm doing this. This is pretty amazing for me. This is a project that's been in the works for quite a few years. And I'm just happy that I'm finally in a place where I can put together a podcast and hopefully grow a community around this podcast that brings hope and joy and healing to those who are needing it and, vice versa. Because truth be told, I'm struggling every day. And I do know that the interactions I've had with those, the lovely people in my life have helped me get through some pretty difficult times and beat some of those demons that have been generational and end some cycles that have been generational as well. So that being said, I'd like to talk about maybe a little bit about the show, why the wishbone, and we'll go from there. But the wishbone, why did I make the wishbone the symbol of the podcast? For those of you who don't know, the wishbone is the international sign for OI. So that's osteogenesis imperfecta. It's a bone disease where there's 8 different types, and we all form collagen in an abnormal way. And I suffer from type 4. Now, suffering is not necessarily a bad thing, and you'll come to learn that as you listen throughout the podcast. Suffering definitely can be a good thing, in my opinion. But I had to be genetically tested for that because I would have bet money that I didn't have a bone disease. It's also known as brittle bone disease. And I have over 40 breaks under my belt. And I assumed I had hard earned every one of those breaks, considering the type of upbringing I had. But it turns out that maybe the OI had helped a little bit in getting some of those breaks. My youngest suffers from the same OI that I do. And my oldest, he didn't test positive for it, but he has several breaks under his belt too. So I would like to think that the diagnosis is a little suspect. But with that being said, you'll notice in the channel art that the wishbone, while brittle and a symbol of hope, is blackened. And it's definitely a symbol of the fire that we all carry in us. And sometimes that fire can get out of hand and burn us and burn those around us. And it can also keep us warm, giving us direction and clarity in thought. So it's definitely a good symbol for kind of how we, deal with our demons and also our angels, as it were. I am not religious, but it's a pretty good analogy. And then you'll also notice that there's residual flames and also ferns growing on that wishbone. And ferns are something that I liken to people. They're very unique, just like we are. They occur in all shapes, forms, sizes, growth habits. Anywhere that life is trying to find purchase, ferns will definitely be one of the first to do so. They're amazing. And if you don't know this about me, I'm a huge planty nerd. I'm a huge natural nerd. I love all things nature, that is for sure. So that is the whole story behind the wishbone in the Wishbone Podcast. With that being said, this is the Genesis episode. And so I would like to start this Genesis episode with my Genesis. Before I do that, I do understand that this could be potentially embarrassing. I can understand that it could blow up in my face, this podcast, but it could have every opportunity and chance to be cathartic and helpful. And I understand I might get some blowback from family, and if I do, just reach out to me and, I'll do my best to respect your wishes. But most of the time, it's going to be just about my life and how I see it. So let's get down dirty and talk about my dad and kind of how he came to be. Then we'll switch over to my mom. We'll wrap it up. So, my dad, what I've been told, we have Greek roots. My dad was either born in Greece or his parents were born in Greece, something along those lines. They immigrated here to Utah. And if you guys don't know about Utah, yeah, they were Mormon. And if you didn't see that coming, I don't know how you didn't see that coming. That's not a surprise ending. Everybody in Utah is Mormon. I don't care what they tell you. But yeah, so they were Mormon, and experienced a lot of financial prosperity in Utah. My grandfather started a cement company, a concrete company, where he somehow invented a new way of waterproofing cement, and that kind of propelled him into his prosperity. My grandfather, when he came over, had started a trucking company. Whether my great grandfather had started a trucking company, which was later bought out by Swift Trucking, if you've ever heard of them. My grandpa Dan, Daniel Raymond Dippo, kind of fueled our family's dynasty, if you will. The Dippos are kind of a big name in Utah. They own a lot of businesses there and kind of pull some weight. However, the divide between that side of the family and my side of the family is pretty big. I don't know too many of them. But Dan Dippo met my grandmother, Helen Dippo, and she was supposedly the love of his life. They ended up having 5 kids, and they ended up getting divorced later on, where my grand never remarried, and my grandfather remarried another woman named Helen, same name. My grandparents had 5 kids. They had 2 boys, my dad, Len, his brother, Craig, my Aunt Leslie, my Aunt Wendy, and my Aunt Cindy, the 3 girls. I do know that my great-grandpa had adopted a Navajo girl, and I'm not sure the details behind that, but I do know that my dad disliked her quite a bit, which isn't surprising. My dad dislikes quite a few people. But I do remember going to quite a few powwows growing up, and that was kind of unique. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but looking back on it, I thought that was, I definitely think it's a cool opportunity that I definitely missed out on. It would have been great to learn more about her heritage and how she came to be in the Dippo family. Maybe we'll find out later on. Yeah, so they had 5 kids. It was a pretty tumultuous upbringing. The war stories I've heard from my dad don't paint my grandpa in too rosy of a picture. He did just recently pass, my granddad. We're almost a week out from his passing. He was 86, would have been 87 this year. And I hope he passed happily and had family and friends surrounding him. But the picture that I have had painted for me doesn't paint too good of a feller. So that generational trauma was passed on to my father, and he did his damnedest to pass it on to me, and I am doing my damnedest to stop it. Okay, so yeah, they had 5 kids, and my Uncle Craig and my Aunt Leslie passed away quite a few years ago. That will be a story for another podcast. And my grandmother unfortunately passed away as well. I believe she passed in 2006. Her and I were actually pretty close with each other. She had a chocolate company, a candy store growing up that was bought out by See's Candy, and she was a renowned cook. We used to have leg of lamb every week with homemade mint jelly, and she suffered a pretty traumatic industrial head injury, and it was pretty gnarly decline from there. She suffered a lot of neurological and mental degradation from there on out, which was sad to see because the earliest memories I have of my grandma are of a pretty independent, happy, strong woman, and she ended up being this frail, schizophrenic type lady. Yeah. Moving on to my mother. So my mother has a trippy story. She is a Vietnamese immigrant, and she tried to escape Hanoi, Vietnam, where our family comes from, the Trans, and there's like 4 last names in all of Vietnam. Tran's one of them. So I have a lot of cousins, of course, but I just recently learned that as they're trying to escape Vietnam, my mom and her 3 siblings and my grandmother, they lose the paperwork for my grandmother along the way. And they were shooting people who didn't have they were shooting people who didn't have paperwork. And so at that very young age, they were all around 5. Now the 4 of them, it's kind of unique because the war was a freaking wild, wild west place, man. It was pretty nuts. So I guess GIs just came in there and did whatever they wanted and had kids all the time. And yeah, there's just a ton of GI kids living in Vietnam now that were kind of outcasts. Anytime they were mixed, it was not good growing up for them. So I have an Aunt Maria who's half black, my Uncle Duck, who's actually kind of a second cousin, which I just recently found out, and my Uncle Joe and my mom were all pretty young and had to say goodbye to their mom and get on a boat and escape over here to the States, which is just such a trip. And the war is such a cancerous tentacled beast that you can understand that the demons my mom and her side of the family faced due to the ravages of war kind of justify why that side is a little messed up. And after learning about that, I kind of took a look back on my dad's side and thought to myself, what the hell happened to the Dippos? Like, how are we so traumatic and hurt on that side? I don't know the answer to that, but war doesn't always come in the form of 2 countries fighting it out, if you understand what I'm saying. So, yeah, they can't make it over the States. My grandpa adopts them. Somehow they come into contact with my grandpa, their adopted dad. And he marries a woman named Miss Hoa, who's also Vietnamese. So I'm assuming while he was in the army as a cook, he met my grandma and met Miss Hoa and then brought their family over. Miss Hoa ended up having several kids with my grandpa, my Aunt Linda, my Aunt Tuvon. They're great, lovely people. We're not that close with each other, but I have met them a few times and they are, definitely great people. But my mom struggled. So my mom struggled not having a mom, not having a dad, not having an identity. America at that time probably sucked for Asians, for Vietnamese people. Um, we had the Korean War, then we had the Vietnamese War, and everybody blamed all their lost GIs on my mom, it seemed. And so she just had a very hard time growing up. And with that being said, she met my father at a very young age. From what I can tell, it was anywhere from 12 to 14. And then anywhere from 12 to 15, got pregnant. Um, my father at this point was 18, 19, had already had a son, my oldest brother, Nicholas. And the demons he faced and the struggles that he had to not deal with caused that relationship to crash and burn, from my understanding. And Nicholas's mom, Camille, decided to end it. And it was just better, I guess, in her situation to just take my older brother and leave. Now, back in the day, from what I can tell, it was a shit show for women. Men could pretty much have multiple families and be fine, and they could stick with the family they wanted, whereas the women had to kind of pull their resources as much as they could and make shit work. So, kind of crazy. Hate the fact that that's how it was and kind of still is, but nonetheless, that's where we are. And so, with that being said, his first relationship doesn't work out too well, and he meets my mom. They end up getting pregnant. She has me. It's a very difficult delivery. And then 13 months later, she has my brother, Ray, who I just found out, by the way, is named after my grandpa. My grandpa's name is Dan Raymond Dippo, and my brother's name is Raymond Charles. I didn't know that. Growing up, just was not common knowledge. Okay, so after some trials and tribulations and 2 kids, they decide it's not working. So my mom kind of digs out, and my dad kind of gives us to his brother to watch as he kind of deals with his young life. I'm not sure what happened there. And my mom moves on and meets a wonderful man named Mike. Mike, from everything I know, was an amazing man. And I get the gist that he was still in love with my mom when they split, but props to him. He just recently passed, and he was an amazing father to my 2 young sisters. So my mom and Mike had 2 daughters, Cammie and Chris, and I can't really say enough about this guy. He raised 2 beautiful women, and he had every opportunity to kind of fuel that fire, the demons, but he decided to choose his daughters instead. So mad props off to my mom choosing a good guy, and to Mike for being that guy. And then, so they split, and I don't see my mom very often. I see her off and on growing up, maybe a dozen times. And then, the angel comes into our life. So while I'm with my uncle Craig and his wife Peggy, a lot of horrible things happen. Kind of really formidable things happen. And while that's happening, my dad has met a woman named Maria who is from Juarez, Mexico. And this lady turns out to be the saving grace of our family. So Maria, who is my mom, she raised me. She was this incredible person, and I can't tell you how indebted I am to her for why I'm not a drug addict or dead on the street or locked in jail with 30 kids, is because of this wonderful person. So Maria comes to meet my dad through some sort of janitorial work. She was an immigrant. She earned her citizenship. And that is what makes America great, full stop. America is built on the backs of immigrants. And I don't care what your political affiliation is. We're one of the greatest countries in the world because we are a country of immigrants. Say what you want. So she comes over here with 2 daughters, my sisters, Odelia and Jessica. Wonderful, wonderful people. Salt of the earth. They are the people I'm the closest with as far as my family goes. And I love them dearly. And the 6 of us grow up in Glendale, Utah, what we called the ghetto growing up. And then they had a 5th kid. My mom, Maria, and my dad had a 5th kid, my youngest brother, Leonard. So that makes 8 of us. Not all connected by blood, but definitely all connected. And as my mom would go on to point out, blood is not always thicker than water. And that definitely rang true in my experience. And they stayed together. My mom and my dad stayed together until she passed in 2020. And I'm sure he is just completely lost without this amazing person. Now, he gets by, don't get me wrong. He's definitely a capable human being, but my mom definitely centered that man. So he definitely lucked out with his third serious relationship. I don't know how many relationships he had, but he definitely lucked out with her. And so did we all. Yeah, so that really is the genesis of how I come to be speaking to you into a mic on this podcast called the Wishbone Podcast. Had wonderful people in my life. It wasn't necessarily 1 or 2 people, but it was definitely a plethora of people. Definitely a village was needed to raise me. And so, considering this first segment is over, tell me what you think. Is this something that you're interested in hearing some more of? I find it incredibly awkward that I'm talking about myself into a mic with no one in the room, and no one asked me to do it. So this is the awkward part. However, as we progress, I believe we can build a community, and it will all be worth it. We're going to move on to what is going to be a normal segment of every podcast here on out, which I call Gray Matters. Gray matter is a play on the word gray matter, being your brain, the stuff between your ears, and I like to tickle it. So I like to do thought experiments. I like to do philosophical questions that get you thinking, hmm. So with that being said, today we're going to kick off the Genesis episode with a big one. What is the purpose to life? Think about it. It's homework, only if you want it. You don't have to do it. And then next week's episode, I'll kind of give you my 2 thoughts on the question. And hopefully we get some feedback from listeners later on down the road, and we can talk about that as well. But I'd like to kind of make it a full circle on how that has been shaped, that view I have on that question has been shaped, and why it is what it is. This podcast will be brought to you in 30-minute episodes. We're going to be releasing episodes every Wednesday. Why Wednesday? Why not? That's what I got to say to that. And so if you feel like you can get some sort of benefit from this podcast, if you feel like you can add something to this podcast, definitely hit me up, please. Definitely check out the website, www.wishbonewithluca.com. Be show notes. Check those out. I'm going to try to put together kind of what we talked about in each of the show notes, give you an idea what to look forward to. And yeah, if this is going to help you out in any sort of way, I would love to hear about it. Well, that's it, folks. Thanks for stopping by. Make sure to check out the show notes. As always, let's give them something to smile about. And we'll see you guys next week.